Well, my name's Paul Devereux. I edited the Lay Hunter Journal for 20 years in the 1970s and 80s, and indeed to the mid-1990s. I'm currently a founding editor of a journal called Time and Mind, a journal of archaeology, consciousness and culture. And I write a lot of books and papers, some of them academic, some of them for popular readerships. And I'm a columnist for Fortune Times Journal, amongst other things.
The broad framework for this weekend, and indeed for the film we're putting together, is, as the name suggests, Megalithomania. So a focus on megalithic sites the world over. Why do you think the ancients went to such trouble to build them?
Well, as I explain in my book Sacred Geography, we started out, the human race, long, long ago, worshipping or venerating natural sites in the landscape, topographical places, mountains, caves, springs and so forth, even trees, sacred trees. And at some point, different times, different cultures and societies, people started to, as it were, improve on nature. They started to build their own monumental sites. And this was often accompanied by bringing material from the older venerated natural sites. So, for example, Newgrange in Ireland has quartz rocks in its structure that were brought from the Wicklow Mountains 60 miles away. Some of the burial mounds, say in Cornwall, have clays from 30 or 40 miles away, brought to build up. No need, plenty of clay locally. But these things were like relics of sacred places that were brought to, if you like, give power, give significance, to give legitimacy to the new monuments that were being built. The reason for the monuments varies a lot from culture to culture and age to age. To begin with, people used rock art to embellish the natural places. It might be a rock face, it could be a cave or whatever. But sometimes they were aligned to the heavens, so, rising sun, setting moon, whatever it might be. At certain times of year, they fitted in with the ritual calendar of the people who were using and building and using the monumental site. There were monuments that were built for burial, for funerary celebrations. There were monuments that were built for the gathering of the tribes, and probably quite a few built for shamans and priests or whatever to commune with the spirit world. So there's a multiple set of uses. There's no one explanation for monuments around the world.
Why do you think that in a modern context, though, that these same sites, these same edifices, are now speaking to modern people?
Because of books and internet and so on, things like this. You can go back to the history. I mean, in the 16th, 17th centuries, people, wasn't until then, in early modern times, that people really became aware that these were monuments. As we know, at Avebury, for example, people just dug the stones up, broke them up and used them to build pigsties, for example. So this idea of reverence of monuments is really quite recent. And when the early antiquarians wrote about them, made if you like, the educated classes aware of this, it built up. And it is then the development of archaeology, where people began to understand a little bit more about the layers of time that were involved and trying to understand what was happening. And more information, and in recent decades, two particular areas of development in archaeology, and in, even in earth mysteries, the ability to go to a site, a stone circle, whatever it might be, and see how it fitted into the landscape. Did it align to planetary or stars? Did it align to a sacred peak in the distance? I mean, the Hurlers stones on Bodmin Moor in Devon. Cornwall, I'm sorry, they're built exactly where a distant natural rock outcrop, a tor, is just visible. So you had a lot of this just visibility thing going on, as though still making a nod, acknowledging the earlier natural venerated site. So positioning was very important. And archaeologists and others became aware of this. They started using their eyes. Instead of just looking at a stone circle as if there was a frame round it, start looking at its position in the landscape. And then more recently still, people have started listening to sites, because there's various types of acoustic phenomena associated with some of them that have been missing. And slowly we build up an information picture of these sites that gives a little bit more, tell us a little bit more of how they were used, how the people of the Stone Age saw and heard things and understood the world around them. They were just as bright as we were, but they had a different take on reality, different take on the world than our mainstream culture has. And some of this resonates with modern people today. And this information has got out through popular books, on television, on the internet. And some of it's very good, and some of it is jumbled, phony information, misinformation. And the trouble with, I think, Earth Mysteries today, it's a jumble of this, some really good material, some highly speculative, and some downright misinformed. So we have a jumble. But people come to it because there's a great spiritual hunger today. The regular mainstream religions, if you like, no longer perform the function that they used to do in society, in Western society. And so people still have a spiritual need, but there's not a regular spiritual supermarket to go to get the sustenance. And so they look around, and so people get into Buddhism or into other religions, or into meditation, or into other spiritual practices. And part of that panoply of things is the idea of sacred sites, of going back to nature and going back to an earlier, simpler view, another world view. There's a hunger for a different world view than the one we have in the mainstream arena now. And so it's a hunger fed by media.
I think you're absolutely on the money with that. I think people have become cynical, for want of a better word, with the trappings of a modern existence, certainly in the industrial world, and as you say, hunger for some kind of spiritual sustenance, and perhaps look to the past to see whether or not we took the wrong fork, perhaps.
I think there's a bit of reassessment goes on, and also a hunger for something. Here in Britain we pioneered the Industrial Revolution, and this involved a lot of people, rural folk, being brought in from the countryside and put into factories for woolen mills or whatever it might be, and iron casting and all the rest of it. And this took a drain of the culture, which was largely rural based, with rural traditions and local witches and herbalists and so on. That got very much fragmented. And I've done research myself into parts of Europe where, if you like, peasant culture existed for longer than in this country, because the Industrial Revolution touched them much, much later. And even in parts of this country, like the Cotswolds, we actually have the names of the last known witches and seers in certain villages. They persisted up until the 19th century, and I think a few still persist. There was this huge rupture in our culture, in Western culture, and you look back and yes, people today feel in a way disenfranchised. They often can't articulate it, they just feel there's a need to get back to some basics and sort of reconstruct their own lives within that frame. So it's very popular, the call of the stones, there's something mysterious and enigmatic. But somebody said, who was it, I can't remember, but every age gets the Stonehenge it deserves. And what a lot of these prehistoric sites are megalithic sites are like sort of ink blot tests. People project onto the past that they want. And they actually sometimes don't like the archaeological information that comes up.
That's interesting. I wanted to touch on that a little bit, actually.
Okay.
We are hogtied to a degree by orthodox archaeology, which seems reticent, if not downright iron-willed against assimilating new information, new findings, and thereby altering its view. Why do you suppose they are so resistant to new ideas and new information?
Well, to be absolutely fair, we inaugurated the Time of Mind journal as an academic journal in order to disseminate some of the modern latest archaeological thinking and try and get it out to a broader readership. And so it's the Journal of Archaeology, Consciousness and Culture, very broad remit, precisely for this reason, to engage. And we found absolutely no shortage of modern, perhaps younger archaeologists, very prepared to talk if anybody's listening. But archaeology, like all science, is conservative. And there's a reason for this. If you come around Glastonbury and you see some of the misinformation, you don't want that to get into your mainstream study area. But I found that a lot of archaeologists are very open. They're doing really frontline work now. They're not the same as the old boys, the old professors. You know, these are young and vibrant people who share the modern culture just as much as any of the rest of us. But they're doing careful work, and they base what they do on field research, on real knowledge. Because it's dead easy to start speculating. So I think it was this and that and whatever. Somebody picks on that information and said, oh, it's this and that, and you'd have your Chinese whispers about things. That's not the basis for a science or an archaeology. And it's just like, it's only in recent decade, 15 years, that modern science in general has been allowing debate about consciousness. Consciousness was a taboo subject even 20 years ago. But now it's okay and people are talking about it. So that whole area of sensory information, different states of consciousness and so on is coming much more to the fore. And I like to think that us old hippies of the 60s helped break through that mould. And new information about archaeology, archaeoastronomy and so forth all help open the subject up. So I don't think that view is quite true now. I think a lot of modern archaeologists are really good people. There's still some old lags that don't give up,
But you would say that that some of those things have perhaps championed a more holistic approach to...
Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it. There's more holism now in an archaeological approach. I mean, Archaeoacoustics, an area I'm particularly interested in, the sounds of archaeological sites, and using sound to get more information, to understand them more. Really, the term archaeoastronomy, Archaeoacoustics, was only coined officially in 2003. So it's a very recent area, and archaeoastronomy became active about 25 years ago. And archaeoacoustics is about where astronomy was in archaeology about a quarter of a century ago. So, but these are new areas that open up our understanding and interpretation of megalithic sites as well as other prehistoric sites.
I wanted to touch on that a little more because I myself have been at various sites, particularly in Mesoamerica. That was my area of study. I spent a lot of time in the Mundo Maya, so Yucatan, Guatemala, Belize. Spent time at Chichen Itza, as of course everybody does.
Yeah.
And one of the things I was introduced to there, quite synchronistically, was at the ball court, where you can stand and clap. And when you clap, you get an echo from the stucco work in what's called the ball court that makes a chirrup.
Yeah.
And this chirrup, apparently, and I did some research into this myself, echoes the Quetzal bird.
Well, actually, what that is, I've done and recorded this myself. It's the Castillo at Chichen Itza that produces this, and the Castillo is a temple dedicated to Kukulkan, the Mayan serpent bird. that became the later Aztec Quetzalcoatl. And the actual temple stands on a stepped pyramid, and up each face of the pyramid are 365 steps, very, very steep, as you'll know, with a high rise in the steps. They're ceremonial steps. And if you are located near what they call the Temple of Venus there, on the edge of the plaza, the open plaza that surrounds the Castillo, and you clap your hands or produce a percussive sound, you get an echo, a picket fence echo that comes off the steps leading up to the temple of Kukulkan, which has open doorways. And so the echo goes up to it, and then there's this chirp echo at the end that comes out of the actual temple. And the acoustic signature of that chirp is very similar to the primary call of the Quetzal bird. And the Quetzal bird was a local bird. There's not so many around now, but still some. It has wonderful plumage. And the priests, the Mayan priests of Kukulkan, used the plumage from the Quetzal bird in their headdresses. And so we have this weird acoustic resonance. Of course, at the same time, at the equinoxes, the sun, I think it's the rising sun at the equinoxes, throws a serrated shadow down the balustrade of the set of stairs that produce this chirped echo. And it's like a diamondback snake crawling out of the top of the thing, down this light and triangles of shadow and light, sunlight, all the way down. Because the sun is rising, it seems to move down. And at the bottom it connects with the stone carving of a serpent's head. It is Kukulkan coming out of his temple. And so you've got a light sound, a sonne lumiere of the prehistoric or pre-Columbian world.
Which is pretty impressive when you start to think about it.
I think so.
Where you've got an ancient people that are capable of incorporating into, let's face it, a massive stone edifice.
Big structure. But it is amazing, but I've become less amazed the more I've gone into this thing around the world, how sophisticated people were. And the sensibilities that our modern, say, artists who do installation pieces, or our architects who use, before there was ever electricity, people were still using light and sound for expressive purposes. In these cases, they are ceremonial or ritual purposes. But it's still the same sensibility we have today, only today we do it with electronic equipment, There they did it with stone and sunlight and moonlight and shadow. And echoes and ringing rocks and so on.
Do you suppose that there's an argument then to suggest that the ancients were intentionally speaking out across the ages to us in the knowledge that this is going to be around for a long time?
Oh yes, I think there was definitely a sense that you don't build the structures with great big stones or careful architecture unless you're creating something that you want to last for ages. Now, it might be just that they were thinking in terms of the Mayan long count or whatever. But the sense of time and transcending time was definitely present. I wouldn't necessarily say it was a deliberate attempt on their part to speak to us across the ages. It was simply a question of literally monumentalizing what they did. And the word monument comes from the same roots as the word memory. Mm-hmm. And so it's built in. That is the concept of what a monument is.
Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. On a more pragmatic note, how do you imagine they went about building these monuments?
Blood, sweat and tears, mainly. If you go to some of the Peruvian sites, you can see massive stones, but you can sometimes see where they've linked the stones to lock together. There's no, back in the 1960s, this is one of the things that have come up, various myths about stones being raised by sound came out and have been embroidered ever since. Now, one of these things was supposed to be a Scandinavian fellow said that he'd seen this film, 9mm film, of Tibetan monks using chanting to raise this megalith up to a ledge on a cliff face. And nobody's ever been able to find that footage. And I know somebody who specifically researches old films and so on of the esoteric nature, and he's come to the conclusion it never existed. But there was a lot of literature that came out, Morning of the Magicians and other things, in the 60s and 70s, a lot of which was simply hype. Now, and sometimes it was embellishment on some legend or some concept. Now, in my talk here this morning, I talked about the Bell Stone that's in California, that was in Bell Canyon, and it had a legend associated with it that there was a buried treasure beneath it. And that was a folk way, if you like, a tribal way of saying there's something special about this thing, this rock, because when you hit it, it rang like a bell, hence the name. And then two idiots went up there one night and dug around, literally looking for treasure. And they made the stone fall over and tumble to the bottom of the canyon, where it didn't ring anymore. So in a way, they found the treasure and then screwed it. So what you have to be aware of is that sometimes people take literally comments, thoughts, or of things that have come down through the ages that are allusions to something. And so the next thing you know, the stones of Stonehenge, the lintel stones were raised by sound power and so on. Well, there was definitely acoustics, and there may be a reference to that. But it was blood, sweat and tears. And we, in a way, we disenfranchise. We insult the elders by saying, oh no, you had ancient astronauts, or you had some magical system for doing this. Really it was just hard work and good architects and engineers. That is our heritage, and we shouldn't dismiss it and fly off the earth with aliens or whatever. We really should respect our true heritage. But there were acoustics, and there are acoustic elements, and we just got to understand what they really were and how they were remembered down the ages.
I agree entirely about the notion of respect for the technological and engineering achievements of our ancestors. But given that places like Baalbek in the Lebanon, Stonehenge, the pyramids, contain huge pieces of stone, which present significant problems to contemporary engineering skill, to try and replicate these feats. Do you think that the cultures responsible had a greater technological benchmark, if you like, than we currently give them credit for?
I think they had. I think they say, if we take Egypt, I think the priests of dynastic Egypt had skills and knowledge that was kept secret. I mean, I'm sure they knew about magnetism, for example. I even think they may have levitated small figurines in various ways. I'm dead sure they had a real acoustic knowledge, but not to move big heavy pieces of stone around 1,000 tons. You know, we know how some of the stones were, the rocks, say for the Ramesseum, the great, Ozymandias sculpture. We actually know it's been found where they brought it up from the river after floating it from Aswan and so on. They're magnificent, they're amazing, and they use skills that we're not very used to now and that we would find almost impossible. But skills come and go. It's very hard to find somebody, for example, today that could make a wooden cartwheel. That knowledge, that technology subsides, it falls away. The use of certain stones in Egypt, granite, particularly Aswan granite, was referred to as maat, which meant a spiritual, magical stone that had spiritual connotations.
M-A-A-T, maat.
M-A-A-T, yeah.
Yes, I know.
Whereas ordinary, mundane rock was limestone. So they distinguished the stone. And there was two reasons, in my view, just my view of this, that the granite had two characteristics. One was it's radioactive. I've measured the radiation inside the Great Pyramid, and it's 5 or 6 times above the ambient radiation level around the pyramid outside. And the other characteristic is that cut granite, particularly Aswan granite, makes sound. It rings when you hit it.
I spent time at the Great Pyramid in 2002, and I had the great good fortune on the day I first went out there to have the place to myself. There was one other guy there. There'd been one of these tourist scares on, and nobody else was there. There was me and one other guy. And I went up to the King's Chamber, and as I'd wanted to do for some time, I lay in the sarcophagus, and I began chanting. The energy from the reverberation and the echo that set up and then was coming right down into my centre, it had me buzzing for weeks afterwards. Absolutely phenomenal. And so I have no doubt that you're absolutely onto something with the acoustics.
Oh, no, 2 ways. At the King's Chamber, yes, I also was fortunate in that nobody had been in for 3 months before. It had been shut down because the French were doing stuff at the bottom of the in the Queen's Chamber, and they shut it off. We got special dispensation to go in, and so I got it fresh. It was interesting because one of the things that happened was my knees started shaking, and the Egyptian guide I had with me, his knees started shaking as well, and we had a job standing. It was very powerful, and there was an old Arab who, when we came out, offered me this little drink in a glass and silver cup, and Mohammed, my guide, said, don't, and he refused to take it. But I thought it'd be rude not to, so I said thanks, and I drank it, and instantly, well, within moments, my knee stopped shaking. But when we got outside, Mohammed, who hadn't drunk any, collapsed. He couldn't stand up. So I said, well, you see, you should have taken that. So the old guy knew something that Mohammed didn't. But no, the actual chamber, yes, I mean, it's radioactive because granite can emit radon, and it does in there, and it builds up. So the chamber is radioactive, and the chamber resonates at 112 hertz. And that's interesting because that is the base resonance that we found when we did our ICRL work, looking at Neolithic chambered monuments in southern England and in Ireland. And we found a common resonant frequency of 110 hertz. We are an interdisciplinary group, and so we had a neuroscientist as part of it, and he conducted some experiments at UCLA for us, and we said, is there anything special about this frequency? And he said, I don't think so. But he said, I'll check it out, and he took 30 subjects, 15 men, 15 women, and he exposed them to a series of acoustic tones, only one of which was the 110 hertz, 112 hertz, that region. And did quantitative EEG measurements of the brain to look at activity levels. And what happens, like a switch at this 110, 112 hertz, is that the activity levels of the frontal lobes change over. And by the time you say you get to 130 hertz, it's gone back again. So it has regional brain effects that we've actually measured and imaged now. And it quietened down part of the brain that are normally active. So this is an important finding, and can incidentally be read on Time and Mind. The actual clinical paper is there, it's been peer-reviewed there. And so we know it would obviously be a sound that could have helped set up a ritual situation. And as I say, we found it happened at Newgrange in Ireland, happened in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, and so on.
So the quieting of the mind for meditational purposes, then?
Well, it might have been, and might have been for deeper stuff than that. It happens only in the theta range of electrical activity in the brain, and it's it could have been for altered states work, certainly, meditation or whatever. But this actually brings up another point. This knowledge, this what I'm talking about now, is available. It's fully researched, expertly done. Yet if you go and listen to a New Age presentation about acoustics, there's all sorts of things like levitation of stones and this, that and the other. And the real story is not being told because most people don't go back and read source material, but it's there. Now, when we were wild and woolly hippies in the 1960s and early 1970s, the literature wasn't there. We had to forge it. And by forging, I mean...
make it yourselves.
Building it ourselves. But now it's there. There's a lot of literature. And I really wish people would go back and look at it and see what the latest work is. By people who do it full time, you know. And it's a very important aspect. And I think we lose the track of what's real and what's not real in this whole story of the ancient past.
Just a couple of more questions just to round up. We see a great many similarities in a lot of the megalithic sites over the world, whether that be in construction methods like at Tiwanaku and other places, using massive stones and interlocking with very, very fine or little or no mortar, alignments to celestial bodies, the sun and the moon and the stars, along perhaps earth energy grids as well. Why do you think there are so many similarities on a global scale?
Well, there are only so many ways you build stone monuments. So familiarity and similarities will occur simply because of technical reasons. Human beings have always gazed at the sky and built their mythologies around the heavens, and they vary. But, you know, like the helical rising of Venus was very important to Mesoamericans, for example, and Venus, very important to the Mayans, and so on and so forth. And different cultures had different... I mean, in the Andes, they don't have constellations of stars like we do. Their constellations, primarily, are dust clouds in the Milky Way, because the Milky Way is so vividly clear in the Andes. These dust clouds make very distinct shapes. So they're the Inca constellations, if you like. So, but whatever form it took, people worshipped the heavens or saw their gods and their mythologies reflected in the heavens. So when they built temples, and a temple ultimately is to link heaven and earth, they would align the sides or use sunbeams coming in, you know, the Coricancha, the son of the sun, the Inca leader, sat once a year in this gold-lined alcove, so that the rising sun would shine in and he'd be there in his resplendent aura of light and so on. So they used it for impressive purposes, for ceremonial and ritual purposes. So it's not surprising that different cultures, never in contact with one another, as far as we know, would still align to the heavens and so forth. As far as energy grids go, forget them. They don't exist. And I've been old enough and I've been round long enough to know who invented them, who put them into the literature and where they came from. However, there are geological energies at places, and a lot of temples were placed where geological energies are pretty strong, where there's magnetic variation and so on. Because we also know that magnetic variation can affect the temporal cortex and can produce visionary material. And the radiation does too. We discovered that on the Dragon Project, which we started in the late 1970s. And we found people where we knew there was a radiation anomaly. People would report quite independently and unknowing one to another, having sudden vivid visions where normal reality was blotted out for 2 or 3 seconds and some other image would come. It could be an animal, it could even be a car with people in it, or it could be a scene. And all these things have been reported in places with high radiation anomalies. So we know that Bath, the springs of Bath, are radioactive waters, you know, because we floated Geiger counters where they come out and they chatter away. I'm not talking sort of 3 Mile Island type of radiation, but radiation that's 3, 4, 5 times the normal background. And a lot of people went to healing places that had that level of enhanced radiation. And it might be a bit like sort of radioactive homeopathy or whatever, but it definitely can affect visionary states. But there's no real research on that, because where the hell would you get the funding to do that in any depth, you know? But that's what we've found.
So Earth energy is reflected as magnetism and radioactivity.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about Earth energies. You must know where it comes from. And I sat in the pubs in Portobello Road in 1965 and so on, and I know where these were originated, these ideas. And we were full of it. We loved this stuff, you know. I'm just depressed that 50, 40 years on, it's still going around, and it's not based on factual material. People convince themselves. People can dowse, they can dowse for water, and I think they're picking up subtle changes in the natural energies of the Earth. But the idea of grids partially came from Russia, partially came from Chicago, and it's been wide. This is the thing about people getting ideas through the media, through books, and then people will do a documentary on it, or they'll do one thing and another, and nobody goes back to the root of the story. It's a corridor of mirrors. And it's hard to pick up the original fact from all the reflected images. So it's just a warning from an old guy.
Paul Devereux, thank you very much.
Very welcome. Megalithomania.